Good afternoon. Hi, my name's Nick Fleming. I'm Associate Director, Transport and Mobility at BSI, and I'm really glad to be joined by Catherine Marris, Head of Innovation at Motability, the charity. Hi, Catherine. We're going to be talking about how BSI is working with organisations such as Motability to help make electric vehicle charging accessible for all. And how a new BSI standard called PAS 1899 can be one of many catalysts for positive change in that area. We're going to deliver this presentation jointly, and shortly I'll be handing over to Catherine. I want to say here that we're really keen to take questions either during the presentation or at the end of the presentation. So you'll be able to use the Q&A function to do that hopefully you can find on your screen towards the bottom. If you leave your questions there, we'll either respond to them as we go or we'll try and round them up at the end. I just wanted to do a bit of scene setting before we dive into the detail about the new standard, why the transition to electric vehicles is important, what we are seeing in terms of issues and barriers, and Catherine that will then start to talk a bit more about why this standard was needed and some of the specific barriers we're trying to overcome in terms of accessibility. So hopefully my slides are moving on. And Catherine, can you just confirm that they've moved on?
Yeah, they've moved on.
Fantastic. So yeah, we're starting to see a shift towards electric vehicles. And that's important for a number of reasons, but primarily electric vehicles are going to play a really important role and will be an important enabler in the moving away from a reliance on fossil fuel vehicles and helping us to move towards a cleaner, decarbonised transport system. And we need to decarbonise our transport system for a couple of important reasons. It's the largest emitter of greenhouse gases, which has a negative impact on our environment, as we know, but also on our health. And transport is the largest, road transport is the largest, one of the largest causes of pollution in our towns and cities. So electric vehicles will be part of the transition away from fossil fuels. And the government has set some very ambitious targets to help affect that change, including the ban on the sale of new petrol and diesel cars and vans that comes in 2035. So, you know, there's a real line in the sand there. Currently, the number of full battery electric vehicles on our roads is actually still quite small, but that is changing. And in the last 6 to 12 months, we've seen the sales of new and second-hand battery electric and hybrid vehicles really increasing quite rapidly. As we see improvements in battery performance, perhaps starting to meet some of these concerns around range anxiety, and also, and you know, we've all probably noticed this, an increasing investment in public electric vehicle infrastructure. So we've probably all noticed visibly more EV charge points on our streets and in service stations and various other sites. Despite that, you know, that there are barriers to the transition to electric vehicles, including, you know, the cost and price point, which is still quite prohibitive. There's also barriers in terms of those that are wanting to switch across to electric vehicles from petrol and diesel vehicles. And this is really what the PAS is trying to address in many ways. So the transition to electric vehicles must be an equitable one. Nobody should be left behind, nobody should be disadvantaged. But what we're aware of is, you know, that's not necessarily the case at the moment. There are barriers that some individuals will experience, physical barriers to using and charging electric vehicles on the public network. And that's what we're really here to talk about today. But the good news is there's lots of opportunities to improve that situation and to build on fantastic research and work that's being done by charities such as Motability and other organisations that we'll mention. And part of this good work has been the development of the standard PAS 1899, which has been sponsored by Motability and also the government's Office for Zero Emission Vehicles. Catherine, I'll hand over to Catherine now, who's going to tell you a bit more about some of these challenges facing users of EVs, in particular users with disabilities. So Catherine, over to you.
Great, thanks, Nick. So I think the key question to ask ourselves here is why does charging, and particularly public charging, need to be accessible, and why do we need to make that case for accessibility and be aware of how important it is? First to say, 1 in 5 people in the UK report a disability. So this isn't talking about kind of a small subset of the population. This is really talking about a large group of people that should have their requirements met through the transition if we want this transition to be kind of socially but also commercially successful. We've done some research with Ricardo Consulting that estimates that by 2035, there's going to be 2.7 million disabled drivers or passengers in the UK, and that up to half of them, because of their particular home parking situation, will have to rely on public charging because they won't be able to charge at home. So again, this really underlines why the need for public accessible charging is so important. There's also something about the need to avoid expensive retrofitting. What we know right now is that a lot of disabled people are choosing not to transition to EV because they find the infrastructure inaccessible, or they're concerned about range, all very valid concerns. But eventually, when the 2030 mandate does come in and people are in a sense almost forced to switch to EVs, there's going to be a lot more customers on the road that are trying to use charge points and finding that they can't use them. And at that point, suddenly a huge amount of the industry will have to retrofit to be able to kind of meet their customer base. So that could be really expensive. So this is also about being commercially smart and thinking about inclusive design at the start. I think the other thing I want to mention is how accessibility really benefits everyone, not just disabled people. One example I like to give is kind of single-handed use of a charge point. That could benefit a lot of disabled people, but it could also benefit a parent who's carrying a child in one arm, or an older person who's carrying a shopping bag and also needs to have one-handed access to that charge point. So really, it's about inclusive design for disabled people also means inclusive and better design for everybody else as well. And the last thing, and we shouldn't lose sight of this, is that it's the right thing to do. It's the right thing to build accessible, inclusive infrastructure. We have a massive opportunity to do this now, the likes of which we probably haven't seen for a couple generations. A lot of our infrastructure is very old. We haven't had the opportunity to really build a new kind of infrastructure like the way we do now. So let's take advantage of it and make it infrastructure that's really fit for purpose and fit for the future. Thanks. So just to kind of, I guess, help us visualize some of these key public charging challenges, and I want to talk a little bit about the charge point, but also about the space around it. So what we've seen through our research with disabled people is that charge points, often there's issues with height. Some of them are too high, some of them are too low, which means, for example, if you're a seated user, you wouldn't be able to reach the charge point or use the interface. Space around the charge point, so there not being enough space, for example, if you're using a mobility aid to be able to kind of approach the charge point and interact with the interface. We've seen a lot of interfaces that aren't very easy to use, aren't very straightforward, that don't really give feedback, so it's unclear whether you're charging or not. The result of that is a lot of people are getting out of their vehicles, going up to a charge point using the interface, going back into their vehicles, then realizing they have to exit again because it actually isn't charging, which again, if you have a disability, that can become an even more frustrating experience to have to do that twice. Heavy cables is probably the #1 issue that we come across that people talk about all the time. And again, you hear about disabled people talking about the heavy cables being a big barrier, but also older people as well. So again, this is something we really have to think about. Hand in hand with that, we've seen a lack of cable management systems. So there isn't a way to kind of appropriately and safely store the cable or keep it out of the way or take some of the weight off. We've also seen connectors that take a lot of force to attach. So if you're someone with a dexterity impairment, they would be very difficult to use. The built environment, a lot of times there's a lack of signage or clear and consistent language that's kind of indicating to you, for example, maybe where within a car park is the charge point located. And we've seen really high curbs. We've seen not enough space around the vehicle. Again, if you're using a mobility aid and you're trying to exit your vehicle. And like this photo shows, we've seen poor placement of the charge point relative to the curb or bay. In this instance, either it should be closer to the curb so that you could reach over the curb to interact with the interface, or it should be farther back with a drop curb so that someone can actually mount the pavement and then interact with that interface. These are more general challenges, but we've seen a lot of charge points that are kind of uncovered. So if they get wet, the cables can be really difficult to manage. In dark, far away areas of car parks that don't really make for a very fun experience. No CCTV or lighting, and that makes a lot of people feel unsafe. I think the interesting thing is actually a lot of these changes I'm talking about, it's a long list, but they're quite practical. They're quite small, especially if you think about them from the start. And again, not only would they improve the experience for disabled drivers and passengers, but they'd improve the experience for everybody. So I just wanted to cover a little bit of the work that's been done to date that's kind of fed into and really been complementary to PAS 1899. So the government, for example, did the consumer experience consultation where they asked questions about accessible charging. There was a future of transport regulatory review where the government kind of let people know that they were sponsoring a standard on accessible charging and asked whether it should be made mandatory. There's the EV infrastructure strategy, and again, there's strategies that have been developed in the different nations as well. And again, those strategies at different points have mentioned accessible charging and how important it is. The Department for Transport also had a charge point design project that was carried out, I believe, by PA and the Royal College of Arts. They came up with kind of a iconic British charge point design. Again, that was something where we were kind of having conversations with them behind the scenes, and they considered accessibility as part of that design. There's also been the work on OCPI, which is the Open Data Standard. Again, what's the information we should be requiring charge point providers to be giving to consumers about their charge points? And is there a way to require them to provide accessibility information, for example? So there's a lot going on in the policy space, think about this question, which is really encouraging. On our side, we've been working with another disability charity called Designability. They're experts in disability and design. We funded them to meet disabled people all over the country and have them try out different kinds of charge points. And this resulted in a pretty comprehensive report and kind of definition of requirements for disabled people to be able to charge. And what this exercise was really about is being robust and make sure we had the diverse kind of range of disability represented in our research, and trying to find out what were the issues that everyone was experiencing in common, and that should be the focus of a standard, versus what are issues that people experience that are more about personal preference or maybe aren't feasible for industry to be able to fix. So that was a really important evidence base, I think, to feed into the standard. As part of that work, Designability also created some inspirational design prototypes to kind of say this is what an accessible charger could look like. They're all freely available online, so I'd really encourage people to check them out. We've also just done a lot of kind of having conversations and trying to get people bought into the process. So we did workshops with disability charities and disabled people's organizations, and we did a lot of awareness raising with industry and industry bodies. Yeah, a lot of trying to bring people together on board. And I think that's resulted in a really consensus-driven process, which Nick will talk a little bit more later. Finally, we've also done collaborations with ZapMap, for example, on a survey. We worked with UK Power Networks on a piece of research about how distribution network operators can get involved in accessible charging. Transport Scotland, we helped advise on a challenge that they did to give out funding to create accessible charging products. So all of that has been really exciting to see uptake in the sector and interest in the sector and trying to solve this issue.
Brilliant, thanks, Catherine. So yeah, we've started to talk about what the PAS is trying to achieve, I think, and standards have a really established role in helping to improve consumer outcomes and positive change, which is what we're trying to achieve here. PAS 1899 is the first standard of its kind, as far as we're aware, in the world. So I think it's really showing the UK is trying to, as Catherine said earlier, do the right thing, but also provide thought leadership in this space. In terms of accessibility, we've seen standards having an impact in other areas. So some of those on the webinar will be familiar with possibly familiar with the BS 8300s standard series around inclusive building design, for instance. This has been widely adopted by the construction industry and has essentially become a kind of de facto benchmark for specifying accessible building design. So we're kind of hoping this new standard will do something similar and go some way to becoming a kind of common reference point, if you like, for ensuring that EV charging on the public network is accessible, and a common reference point for all of the stakeholders involved in making that happen. Standards already exist around EV charging and charge points from an electrical safety point of view and an interoperability point of view. I know people often feel, well, there's a number of different connectors at the moment. Without standardization, there would probably be a lot more. So, it's about reducing some of that variation. And we're pretty confident that this standard, PAS 8099, is complementary to those and can be used alongside other standards, including the accessible building standards. In terms of specifically what the PAS covers and how it's structured, we'll go into a little bit more detail on that in a second. But as Catherine's already alluded to, it's concerning itself with public charging, both the design and operation of the charge point, but also the immediate environment around the charge point, so the bay in effect. When you're trying to define accessibility in this context and within a standard, you need the right mix of stakeholders around the table to do that, and you need the right process. And it requires the right mix of technical expertise, but also user insights and research. And there's a lot of robust research that has been done, as Catherine mentioned, before we started work on the standard. And work continued while we were developing the standard as well to ensure it was kind of pulling fresh, good practice into it. So we're going to just look a little bit more at that process of developing the standard. And for those that aren't aware, a PAS is a kind of fast track BSI process. It's really when we want to try and get some good practice into the market rapidly. A PAS is a great vehicle for doing that. So the project was announced at the back end of last year, 2021, and one of the key tasks for BSI was to really establish this steering group. The steering group is a group of experts and relevant organisations to help us really guide the development of the standard and kind of knock the drafting into shape, if you like. And BSI with Motability and OZEV worked together to ensure there was a good mix of government departments, charge point operators, that's CPOs on there, accessibility experts, distribution network operators, trade bodies, consumer networks, disabled people's organisations, etc. We wanted to make sure we had a really good mix, and also a technical author who could help us develop this document. And we had a fantastic technical author in Peter Weldon from GHD, and Peter really helped us to ensure that the standard was that we were taking views across a very broad range of stakeholders and trying to condense those down into requirements that were workable. So the standard should always try and be aspirational but practical at the same time, and sometimes that can be a hard balance. The draft for public comment period we extended to 6 weeks, which was a little bit longer than usual, and we received a lot of comments, and some of the comments related to issues that Catherine's touched upon, things like cable weights, and they led to some additional research being done in tandem with the development of the standard, just to make sure we were really looking at this fresh and pulling in latest good practice. So following a further final steering group meeting, just in the early part of the summer, we were then ready to publish the standard, and that published in October. So we're still in the relatively early stages of getting the standard out there into the market. So you can go and download the standard, and we'll provide the URL at the end of the presentation. But just to clarify, what it really concerns itself with. We talked a bit about this. It's the physical charge point design, and that's everything, including the heights and the cables and the connectors and the visual interface. which we know is important for all users. It's the placement of the charge point and where it is in relative terms to other barriers or obstacles potentially, and that's important for manoeuvrability. The clause around streetscape and public realm around the charge point, again, really looking at the street furniture and some of those things that we've seen pictures of a charge point that is perfectly accessible within itself, but with a bollard stuck in front of it, or not with non-access through a drop curb. So it's trying to join some of this thinking up. Really, you can put an accessible charge point in an inaccessible place, etc. So we're trying to join up that part of it. And then finally, clause 8, looking at the important part of the kind of digital interaction and the digital interface. And again, just credit to GHD here, whose diagrams these are, lifted from one of their presentations. But a key thing for all standards is really being clear about who is the intended audience, because we want to drive uptake of the standard. If we don't, if we don't get uptake of the standard, then ultimately the end users won't benefit from it being created. So, like all standards, we want to ensure it's practical and usable. And one way of doing that is to be really clear from the outset who the onus of responsibility is on in terms of the standard. So in the case of this standard, it's the procurer of the charge points, and that can mean more than one organisation in reality. It could be the charge point operator, it could be the local authority, car park owner, or private landowner. But it's really important because if you're a local authority, for instance, and you're installing charge points, this is something you need to be aware of in order to specify it, so the charge point operator or service provider can follow through on those requirements. So I guess the work we're doing at the moment with Motability and others is really we're going through an awareness drive. We're trying to get this standard into the hands of people within central government, local government, and to start to push it through the supply chain, if you like. But yeah, as I said, this piece is very much around, it does, even though we're saying there's the onus of responsibility is on the procurer of the charge point, ultimately the responsibility is still going to sit with a number of different organisations to make this become a reality. I'll hand back to Catherine now, who's going to talk a little bit more about what Designability have been doing with Motability to bring this to life.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. Just wanted to finish off on, I guess, some of these exciting design prototypes that have been put out there. I think some of the really important learning from Designability's work when they went through this process was that engaging directly with disabled people and really listening to them is incredibly important when thinking about accessibility. Even if you kind of are implementing or installing something in the ground and you're following the standard, that's fantastic. But equally, you should be open to listening to the experiences of disabled consumers who are using that product and really listening to what experience they're having and what changes can make it even better. I think the other thing we really wanted to highlight through the work was that not every disabled person uses a wheelchair. There are 14.6 million disabled people in the UK, and they are an incredibly diverse range of people, as diverse as non-disabled people. And the disabilities they experience are very different. And so it's important to make sure that installers and designers kind of understand that range of people when they're thinking about a charging infrastructure. In that vein, I think a flexible approach can meet many needs. This is more a design aspect rather than a standardization aspect, but we were finding even having interfaces at 2 different heights, or when you have charging sockets on vehicles that are in 2 different places, people have different preferences and different approaches that work better for them. Standardization is all about trying to find out what's in common and what would make it better for everyone, and we've done that as best as we can. There'll still be some elements that if you could provide a more flexible approach would still get to reach more people, so that's important to think about. And yeah, I guess that general point we always come back to, which is we keep finding that if you make public charging more accessible for disabled people, it also makes it more accessible, convenient, inclusive, a better experience for the general public. So that really supports the business case for accessible charging. So I think just a final slide, we really wanted to leave people with some resources if you want to find out further. So you've got there the link to download PAS 1899 if you want to take a look at the standard in detail. You've also got a website there, access to Designability's prototypes on accessible EV charging. And there's a load of other organizations like UK Power Networks, Urban Foresight, SSEN, Energy Saving Trust that have all done really excellent pieces of research and synthesis on accessible EV charging that you can read about and learn even more. So yeah, hope you've enjoyed the presentation.
Thanks, Catherine. What I'll do now is I'll stop sharing my screen, and I've been unable to see the Q&A, but I don't know if we've got any questions to pick
I
up.
haven't seen any come through. Are there any questions that people wanted to ask either by dropping them in the Q&A or putting them in the chat?
I think we might be off the hook, Catherine. Even though we might not want to be off the hook, I think we are off the hook. So
that's always what I like to hear.
We can wrap up there, and actually we do have one that's come in. Oh no, it's just more of a comment.
Good.
All clear and thought provoking. So
Thank you,
that's
John.
great.
Thanks, Melanie.
And we can obviously the slides can be shared with anyone who's interested, and that makes it always a bit easier with the URLs and everything to find the documents you need. Yeah, Catherine and I can also be contacted with any questions around the standard. Happy to leave our contact information. So yeah, please do get in touch with any questions or if we can clarify anything. But Catherine, should we wrap up there and let the next presenters take over? Fantastic. Thanks, Catherine.
Great.
Thanks again.
Thanks so much.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Nick. Bye.